Thanks everybody for coming in today and sitting with us. I know I'm sure itching if you're especially on the East Coast or Central time frames, you're looking to have your day done and get to that nice beer, which is what I'm planning to do right about after this. But we're going to start, really want to have just kind of a broader conversation about what we've been seeing in the industry around how security program management has changed quite a lot in the last year and a half, especially, and ultimately provide some guidance and things you should be thinking about in your own security programs, if you haven't already, to make sure that we're keeping up with all the changes and sort of nuances of what the technology and the processes we're seeing happening are becoming in the world. So mean this to be absolutely interactive. Feel free to ask questions as we go. Nathan, if you already have your beer going, please have an extra one for me while I'm talking, because I won't be able to have it until we're done. So thank you for that. All right. So real simple agenda today. I talk a little bit about what I've been seeing in the world as it pertains to cloud migrations, how cloud really has changed what we've been doing from a technology standpoint, and then talk a little bit about the people, processes, and tools that fundamentally how a lot of it has changed in our approaches for these things. I think some of this is going to be pretty straightforward, but hopefully as we walk through it, you'll see some of the ways that we can kind of tie a lot of the best practices we've seen over the last 20 plus years can be modified and repurposed, if you will, into today's modern environments. And so we'll talk about how that affects each of those pieces of the sort of the project triad. And we'll also talk a little bit about metrics, because for my purposes, I don't think you can really do any kind of program correctly or in a mature sort of way without having measurement involved in the process. So we'll go through all those kinds of things, the types of things you should be looking for in your security program, and ways to hopefully help you improve and keep on top of all this. So let's start here with what we already know. Depending on who you ask in the security industry, I hear all kinds of stuff about defense in depth. We've been talking about it for many, many years. And there are those people who believe it's over, right? Because the days of the controlled data center don't exist anymore, because we can't isolate our environments into a single controlled building and a single controlled network. Therefore, defense in depth can't really be executed well, and it's gone. And of course, you talk to somebody else the next day and they tell you, oh yeah, defense in depth is the only strategy you need. Don't worry about all these newfangled buzzwords that come out. Defense in depth still works. You just have to do a little bit differently. I would argue somewhere in the middle of that for myself. I mean, I think strategically there are some really valuable pieces of defense in depth, but the lay of the land has changed. There's no question that what we see in the world has changed, specifically because of the adoption of cloud. And because of that, we can't just ignore the new technologies that are coming out, the new processes, the new best practices. But there is still a lot of value to be had in the original sort of framework, if you will, for what we consider defense in depth. So to be clear, everything I'm going to talk about today is not meant to be a disparagement about defense in depth. The practices are still sound, but we do need to evolve into something a little bit different, because frankly, the environments we're managing today demand it. So let's talk about what that kind of looks like. Today, as it stands, cloud adoption is continuing to grow, right? The notion of the single data center is to some extent dying. More and more organizations are moving into the cloud in some way, shape, or form. Estimates here from some statistics we've seen, about 90% of cloud companies have some sort of cloud presence. More often than not, they're doing some form of hybrid approach. So they've got applications or virtualized environments, containers out in the cloud, whether that's public one like AWS or Azure, something to that effect, or if they've built their own. And they still have internal systems, internal data centers, whether that's globally or just in one place. They're still trying to manage those kinds of environments as well. So it's become, just from that alone, a really different sort of way we look at things. It's no longer as simple as putting up a perimeter firewall and calling it a day. We have to approach each of those environments a little bit differently. They function differently. Our control of the underlying infrastructure is a little bit different. And that means we have to approach our security programs in a really different way. Now, cloud adoption's been happening for, gosh, the last 5 years for sure, 10 years arguably, at a very accelerated rate. It just keeps getting faster and faster. But I think we can all agree that what we've seen in the last 15 months has accelerated this into a level that many organizations weren't even expecting. When the COVID pandemic sort of hit in the early part of last year, we saw a lot of really interesting changes happen with organizations. One of the things that I think was most notable was that in the first 3 to 4 weeks of the sort of lockdown timeframes that were happening here in the United States and other countries, the number of remote workers estimated in the United States doubled, about 31% of workers to 62% of workers. We had a massive shift from people working on site to people having to be remote. And it meant that the companies had to respond in kind. Now, whether they had a cloud adoption strategy or not, whether they had a plan or they were prepared to make that move, suddenly didn't matter. You have a massive amount of your workforce is now needing access to applications. They need to be able to communicate with customers. They've got to get their work done. And they're not inside your office building anymore. So whether companies were ready or not, and there were quite a few that were not, the pandemic really accelerated this at a level we hadn't seen previously. And that is perhaps one of the biggest challenges for a lot of organizations. It's not just the normal complexities of moving to the cloud and how do I convert applications? How do I move my legacy programs into that kind of thing? How do I keep my businesses running when I don't control it all? But the security implications of having to do that often were just tossed to the wayside because they were focused on business continuity. And you don't have a plan even in place. Most of those organizations didn't have time to worry about security. But here we are 15 months later. And part of the reason that we're having this conversation today and why the folks at Sync, we talked about having this webinar, was really to like, this is the time for us to be able to sit back and really rethink what we're doing with our security programs. We've had 15 months. More companies are getting used to the remote work thing. We've kind of gotten past the emergency part of the whole pandemic. People are used to new processes. They're used to the new way they access applications. Customers are a little more used to the virtualized interaction. So we've got a chance to have a little bit of a breather. We have an opportunity now to rethink the way that we approach security. If you haven't done it already, again, now is the time. Do not wait past this session. We need to do it today. So let's start talking about this from a security standpoint. Now, I don't think any of you who've been in the industry are necessarily surprised at this. But we've moved to the cloud in a lot of ways because of speed, flexibility, and scale, right? We have to react quickly. We need to be able to spin up new servers and services. We need to be able to do different things in different places. Cloud environments can help you with all of this. It's really kind of an amazing thing that we've seen expansion-wise for organizations. They can reach out globally, sometimes in minutes, and spinning up new systems. They can reach new customers. It's great. But with these things comes a lot of problems, especially when it comes from the security side of things. And over the years, I hear a lot of myths. I'm sure many of you have heard the same things. And it's important as we rethink our security processes, we're keeping these things in mind, because while some of us who are in the security world may look at these myths and roll our eyes, your executives and your non-technical leadership may not. They may think that some of this is true, and it's important when you're considering the next steps in your security process that you are addressing these issues. Most notably, I think, is that misconception that because Amazon or Google or Microsoft, they're huge companies and they must know what they're doing with security, don't really need to do much different, right? They manage it all for me. They take care of all the security. I can put my applications up there and security is taken care of. And I'm hoping some of you are laughing at me right now for saying that, but I still hear it. I still hear executives who believe that kind of thing, and they don't understand why the security team is coming forward saying we have to invest in more tools, purpose-built tools. We need to adjust our processes. We have to retrain people. There's a lot of disconnect there because of this kind of myth. So right from the start, one of the big changes that we need to make for our security programs is that as cloud has empowered our technology and our businesses to move faster and be more dynamic, our programs have to move faster and be more dynamic. And we have to communicate that to the executives so that they understand why these changes are happening. This is not a static one-time thing that we do. We have to make sure that we continue to adjust. A lot of that comes from education and communication with your executives to make sure they understand why you're doing what you're doing. So really, really important that you address these myths, that you train folks, you educate them on why these things aren't true, and reinforce that the need for new processes, new best practices, new methods is because these things just are false, and we have to adjust to the way the technology adjusts. If it helps a little bit, and I've used this to talk to some executives in my time here at Tenable, part of the way that I've laid it out for folks is try to help them understand just how complex cloud really has made things. When I'll ask, C-level executive, CEO or CFO, someone non-technical, what do they think are the assets in their organization from a technology standpoint? And they'll say things like, oh, our workstations, our servers. Every now and then I'll hear someone say applications. But the reality of today is, as we've expanded things out and as virtualized environments make this all much easier, and cloud environments can help us scale outward, most environments are dealing with dozens of different types of assets, and they're not all managed the same way, right? The way we assess security in virtualized environments or containered environments is not the same way that I would do an assessment for SCADA systems or industrial IoT devices, right? There's a whole different sort of process. There's a focus on safety when it comes to SCADA systems versus just security parameters and lock it all down over on the virtualization or cloud side or a container side. Every environment today has far more assets than they realize they have, and they have more different types of assets. And because the expansion of cloud makes this so much easier to do, you're trying to manage all of this stuff with the same old policies, the same old processes, and the same old tools. You're just simply not going to make any headway, right? So we understand that cloud provides a lot of benefits, but we also know it increases a lot of complexity in our environments, and the nature of our business has changed in some cases overnight. And so because of this, we have to take a new approach. And this is, for the standpoint of the title of this session, this is really the part of where security strategies changed. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about process, but policies in a lot of ways, I've seen organizations that review their security policies once every 2 years, 3 years, may say to do it once a year, but it reasonably only happens every couple of years. Today, I'm seeing more organizations reviewing their policies every quarter. Now, that may seem like a lot, but it's an acknowledgement of the speed at which everything's changing, at the way that new assets are introduced into the environment. It requires that policies have to be adjusted to account for new ways of assessment, new regulations you're now responding to, new metrics that you have to report up, new security controls that come into place. If you're going to wait 2 years to put those policies in place, you are just setting yourself up for another data breach in one of these new assets or one of these new pieces to your environment. So the complexity of the situation demands that we do something different. And that's, frankly, that's kind of where we are today. So what are we going to do about it? Well, there's a lot of things that we need to do about it. And the approach I'm going to talk about today is really kind of the evolution, if you will, of what I see in defense depth. We still are going to need those layers of defense. We're still going to need to be able to provide specific security controls for the right types of assets or services that we're trying to protect, right? But we can't take a boil the ocean approach. We can't do everything all at once. So it becomes more important that we start to take a much more risk-based focus and approach our security programs in that kind of mindset, so that we start to prioritize, we start to understand where the real threats exist, and we start to understand where we can essentially fix the biggest holes in our environment, so that we are better mitigating risk wherever it exists, in the right places, in the right ways. Now, I'm gonna caveat myself a little bit. I've been doing vulnerability management type of programs for most of my career, about 24 years now. And I have been just as guilty in the past of trying to boil the ocean when it comes to these things, right? Patch everything, fix every application, harden every server. I'm going to do it all, because any one of those vulnerabilities or any one of those weaknesses were breached. And I think the reality of what we're dealing with here is, we need to acknowledge what we as security practitioners really do for an organization. It's the understanding that we are not actually an IT discipline. We're not truly a technology discipline. We're a risk management function. Now, most all of us are technologists. We have to know and understand technology at deep levels because we're there to protect it. But we're not truly a technology function. We're a risk management function. And if you think of InfoSec as a risk management function, it means you have to take a wholly different view of vulnerabilities, of application weaknesses, of system configurations, of all of it, because now you have to take into account business risk, financial risk, reputational risk. What's the impact to our employees? Is there privacy risk? There's a whole lot of non-technical pieces to this equation. And that's where we start to focus in on the things that actually matter to our business, and then apply those defense in depth layers appropriately. So the evolution is take what we know about layering defense and customizing the things that we need, but we want to tweak it and focus it into the places that are really at risk and that are threatening our most important assets, whatever those might be. So we need to be really careful about this, but that's the core of what we're going to talk about moving forward, is to take that risk-based perspective on how we manage our security programs. Okay. Now, before I jump into the people process tools part of this, I've got several questions that popped up. I'm going to take a moment and see if I can answer some of these here for folks. Let's see. All right. Well, Ulysses, I appreciate the recommendation there about the Power BI add-on for Tenable IO. Keep an eye out on some of our announcements in the future. You may see something you like about that, but I can't talk too much about that at this point. I apologize. Harry, let's see. 37% of jobs can be done remotely. What is your thought on how many actually will? The shift is very tied to managers and their perception of work from home. Do you expect pushback? And what would be the security implications of a mixed bag of workforce? So I'll tell you what I'm observing, and I've talked to a lot of companies on a regular basis as part of my role here. I think we have seen a pretty big cultural shift in this. If you asked me this question 2 years ago, I would have told you there was so lot of resistance by executives. There was still an unwillingness to go to remote work. A lot of belief that it can't be done unless you're on site. And frankly, the pandemic has proved otherwise. A lot of these organizations, even though they went about it very haphazardly, they are now mostly remote workforces. They are seeing that it's working. So a lot of this is going to have to come back to processes. If they were able to make it through and they were able to continue business efforts, a lot of these organizations are shifting their culture and their perception has changed along with it from a management standpoint. We're finding a lot more buy-in for it. And some organizations I've seen who were absolutely adamant about no work from home are now coming out of the pandemic today with full hybrid work policies where people can kind of work where they feel comfortable, and they're going to continue doing work from home or remote. So the perceptions definitely changed. There's still holdouts in that regard, but it definitely has changed. Now, what does that mean for security? Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about that here in the next few steps, but it means that our approach has to change, right? If we were holding out and buying our time for a year and then going to go back to security as it was, that's not going to happen. The commitment to stay remote workforces has held. And I think that more and more CISOs and security leaders are now having to rethink, again, how they do it all to see that this is not a temporary solution, that this is just going to be the nature of business going forward. So a lot of changes are going to happen with this, whether whether we're prepared or not. But that's where we're going there. Okay. Let's see. Ask one more thing here from Michael. Does Tenable provide, and do you see more organizations audit their cloud environments based on best practices? The simple answer there is yes and yes. A lot of the auditing that happens, usually regulatory based, that doesn't change whether you're in the cloud or not. Now, it's sometimes a little more complicated because you've got infrastructure that's not yours, and you might be implementing your assets differently. What may have been a full on metal server is now a virtualized environment or containerized application. Your process for auditing might be different, but the requirement is still there. There's no getting around that. There's absolutely no change in regards to the best practices or the need to do it. So yes, those are all still happening. The best practices still apply pretty much as is. Now, the tools on how you conduct the audit might change. And that's where, as a Tenable employee, I can tell you that's absolutely something we do. And, try to help folks get visibility on those things, and no matter what the asset might be. Great questions. Thank you so much. So let's, I'm going to carry on here. I want to go over some of these recommendations as we've got about a little over 15 minutes left, and we'll try to get some more questions at the end. So let's talk about the people, process, tools, metrics. Let's talk about the changes and the kinds of things you should be thinking about if you're going to mature your program forward in this new world order. If you're already doing these things, fantastic. You're already ahead of the curve. You're doing the right things. I would keep doing them. If you're not quite there yet, like I said, today is the day that you should really walk away from this prepared to talk to your executives and start to make some changes, because going forward, this is going to be what we've got to deal with. So let's do this a little bit backwards. We'll start with the tools. Obviously, Tenable, we're one of the people in the tool space, so we're pretty focused on this. But tools in general, when you are considering the kind of tools that you want to work with in this hybrid environment or fully cloud-based environment, you need to be looking for tools that they don't necessarily need to be cloud-based, but they need to function the way the cloud does. And that means they need to be fast, they need to scale, and they need to be flexible. Right? Those are the same benefits that the cloud platforms provide. So what does that mean for a software or even a hardware kind of perspective? Well, you need to have things that provide you different tools in the toolbox, right? When we talk about vulnerability management as an example, 15, 20 years ago, you had a Nessus vulnerability scanner, little network guy, you gave it a IP range and off it went and scanned your network. Today, that's not realistic, right? If you have a cloud environment where you're spinning systems up and down constantly to respond to customer need, you might have assets that only live for an hour or two. Applications, a Nessus scanner isn't really designed for dealing with web applications and assessing them for the OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities and that kind of thing. So when we're considering how we approach assessments or how we can approach security, you need to make sure that you've got the right tools in the toolbox. Yes, it does mean it's a little more complicated, but our environments are more complicated. So make certain that the tools you're using, they have the right tools for the job, whatever it might be, and use those tools correctly with the right kinds of assets so that you're getting the most data that you possible, you're getting accurate data, and that's going to empower you to make better decisions. The other thing I'll highlight about this too is APIs. One of the underlying powers of these cloud environments is the automation piece. They're all designed and driven to be automated as much as possible. That's a lot of use of APIs, scripting, and that kind of thing. So from a tools standpoint, make sure that your tools support the same kind of functionality. They should be able to be automated. They should have robust APIs. You should be integrated into your cloud platforms, your other services, your other vendors. You want to be able to work in the same way that the cloud platforms do. That wasn't always the case for a lot of years. I know myself personally, I used to kind of manage all of my scan schedules essentially manually back in the day, because I wanted to make sure that I hit maintenance windows appropriately and I notified people on my own time. It's just not feasible anymore. So leverage that automation, make sure the tools you're leveraging also have that built-in automation. They can be tied in to these systems. It just makes everything much more powerful. Everything will become much faster, and it's going to get you a situational awareness in more akin to a real-time kind of scenario. And that's where you really want to have that visibility for what you're doing next. Okay. All right, so let's talk about process changes. I've already talked about the policy thing, but the thing you really want, I'm going to highlight again, I'm going to reinforce this, the goal with processes, as you're rethinking how you go about managing your security program, how you implement security controls, what are the processes we talk to or we teach the IT teams, the operational folks to do. You, again, be fast, go big, be flexible. Policies should not be static anymore. We should not have documents that sit for 3 to 5 years, and the only time you discover it's a problem is when you've been hit with an audit or a data breach and the investigators come in and ask you, when was the last time you reviewed your policies? Okay. You've got to move faster with these things. You have to be more on top of what's going on in your environment. How do we want to protect them? What's meaningful to the business? And then where does risk live in our environment? And again, risk is different for different organizations. Some folks, reputational risk is the most important thing. Others, it's financial loss. So understand what you're really trying to do. Understand risk as deeply as you can in the environment. And then you've got to modify in your policies, your procedures, your processes as you need to, right? Policy documents, I was always thought had to be this sort of like written in stone kind of thing. But today, with the way things change, you're going to build those policies out. You're going to start to execute. And when you see as over time, usually a short period of time, if it's working, great. How do I optimize that? Let's build in those optimizations into the policies. And it's not working, get in there and change those processes and policies, because you don't have the time to waste, not at the speed that these environments scale and not at the speed that people are spinning up new assets into your environment, which just translates to new attack vectors for criminals or nation state actors or whatever else. So move quick. That's the big thing about processes here. You've got to make sure that what you're doing moves at the speed that the technology is moving. Okay. All right, people. Now, people, this is a huge part of the triad. Obviously, I think we do tend to get a little caught up in the technology and the process, because cloud in a lot of ways is a technological advancement that requires process changes. But people, if you don't address the people side of it, this is going to become a major problem and could sink your whole effort in a lot of ways. And we saw this through the pandemic. The shift for remote workforces, use this as an example, was so sudden. A lot of organizations struggled mainly because they never educated their users on what the changes meant, how they were to now access applications or do their work. They didn't do a very good job of communicating that outbound and providing support to people to understand these new processes, understand the new tools. And so they floundered. And in those organizations where they over communicated and provided support and had people standing by to help train their employees, the more education that was done and the more communication was done, the sooner they got out of the chaotic period, the more quickly they were able to get business to normal, sort of normal, if you will. And it also meant that they were able to start moving into this this place that we're talking about today, where they could start to really rethink their business strategies, their security strategies, and understand what their next steps were going to look like going forward. So make sure you have a communication plan as you go through this. If part of that requires that you're educating users and your executives about what these changes mean, how they impact the business, how they're going to benefit, you have to make this part and parcel of the process. You just can't be successful today in a security team without communicating, and then communicating again, and then communicating some more. And then when you're done with communicating, go back and just make sure you need, if you need to do it again. It only serves your best interests if you're out there in front of people, helping them understand why this is valuable, and getting them through to making this a normal part of their day-to-day work. Okay. Last piece. So metrics. Now, again, you talk to a lot of the analyst groups, they typically focus just on the PPT that we just covered. I'm a big advocate for metrics. You've got to measure things to understand what's going on. Now, just like everything else, metrics are going to change. There's no absolute right answer for metrics and how you measure your environment. There's definitely some best practices, but it needs to be relevant to you and your business. And so it's important that as we're talking about technical risk, number of vulnerabilities, the kind of threats in the environment, whatnot, it's really critical to start tying that to business risk in every way, shape, and form, right? It's a different story when you can say, we had 100,000 vulnerabilities in the environment last month, versus we've had a 23% reduction in risk to our primary e-commerce website. That e-commerce website is what the executives know is the most important thing in the business. They're going to understand that any risk to that is a direct impact of the business. That's going to be a much more relevant metric to them than just saying we patched a bunch of numbers. So your business now in the cloud is expanded, new asset types, new ways you're doing all this work. Don't bog the executives down with that. Take the data that you're getting, identify the risk metrics that you're using from a technology standpoint, but translate that into something that the business understands. Not only is it going to be more relevant, but you're going to get far more buy-in from your executives for next steps. When you need to start getting more budget, when you need to add more people to the team, when you need to make changes to direction, if they understand that what it means to the business, you'll be far more successful making those changes happen. So, leverage those business connections as much as possible. I also, just like I used in my example, I really encourage businesses today to move away from volume-based reporting. Raw numbers about the total numbers of assets, vulns, threats, whatever, they just aren't as relevant as they used to be. And primarily because the environment's changed too fast, right? You might have 100,000 vulnerabilities today. You could go fix half of those, tomorrow, and by the time you get around to reporting to executives, you've got 250,000 more vulnerabilities in your environment. All they're going to see is a number going up, and they think that's bad. They have no idea that there's been work done. They don't understand what the trend looks like. They don't understand that you may have mitigated one of the most problematic vulnerabilities in an application. Those things won't be relevant if you're just talking about volume. So always look at trend lines, do metric numbers over time, do trends, really consider how the metrics you're building or using in your tools and in your process evaluations. Make certain that it's tied to business and it's something they're going to understand, conceptually at least, right? Risk going down is a concept everybody understands. So move your metrics to that kind of thing. Make sure your policies and processes align to what you're measuring. All right, we're going to wrap this up here, and then we'll cover whatever questions we have left. So hopefully, the takeaway that you've seen from some of this is that we're really not talking about reinventing the wheel. I don't think there's any big surprises about that. This isn't a revolution in how we approach security in terms of throwing away everything we've had before and starting over. But it has changed, right? Cloud is not going away at this point. More and more businesses are adopting it. Everybody's kind of gotten on board with this is going to be the new way of things for going forward. So we have to adapt and change along with it. The shift that I'm seeing for security teams to understand that they're really a more of a risk management function than technical function, that's been a key step in the right direction. The more that security teams see themselves aligned with folks like the finance team and the legal team, and the less that they see themselves as just the system administrators of security tools, those organizations that get that are the ones that are really adapting well to these changes. And so I would encourage you to really rethink that part if you haven't already. The other thing I'll highlight about the slide, there's a lot of other pieces, but don't throw away the old stuff. Frameworks, standards, the regulations, this is still really good stuff, all right? I am not here to tell you to stop looking at your NIST frameworks or to toss out your ISO 27000 efforts or anything like that. They're good. They're there for a reason, right? But you need to adapt. Right? If it doesn't work for your environment, it doesn't work for the way that you've built your particular environment, your business processes, adapt them. Like you're going to need to make it make sense for your business and for the challenges you're trying to address for you. So leverage that framework. Don't reinvent the wheel if you don't need to, but make sure that you're making it relevant to yourself and not just taking them as set in stone. And well, if I can't bend my environment to these steps, then we're just failing. No, bend the frameworks to account for your business needs and for your risk tolerances, and make sure that it makes sense for your business. Okay, got a few minutes left. Let's dive into some questions. Jason, is that all right?
Lovely, love it. Great timing, fantastic stuff. Really appreciate it. I don't know if you noticed a lot of the chatter going on over here as well whilst you've been talking about. It's been fantastic. So we do have some final questions, and let's jump into them. So I'm just going to stop sharing your screen. So you'll have to remind me. I'm not sure if you got to this question from Michael. Does Tenable provide, and do you see more organizations audit their cloud environments based on best practices?
So we did cover that one a little bit.
Yeah.
Yes,
okay,
the reality is, yeah, we're still doing that for sure.
Okay, cool. Let's move on to these ones. Does Tenable provide real-time monitoring and forensics analysis?
Yes and no. So we do offer solutions for some of real-time monitoring in terms of agents and a particular tool that we refer to as frictionless assessment. And frictionless assessment is essentially a connector into the underlying Amazon AWS APIs. And so as assets spin up, as things come alive in AWS and your subscription, it notifies us immediately. And so we get essentially real time, or as close to it as you can through the these kinds of queries. When a new asset spins up, that means we can assess it, we can do a vulnerability analysis, we can see the threats on it. So yes, there are a couple of tools you could use for that kind of real-time analysis. Keeping in mind that we're not necessarily like, a file integrity monitor, right? So there's not a live, we're recording every single thing for forensic analysis. But if you're trying to get a handle on where are my new assets? Do I know where they exist? What's their vulnerability posture? What's their metadata about them configuration? There are definitely ways to leverage tools that we've got to do that kind of thing.
Thank you very, very much. Question, a follow on from that, how about quarantining offenders?
Quarantining offenders. From a tool standpoint or just from
Ulysses,
like
if you're able to elaborate.
standpoint?
Yeah, how about quarantining offenders? Ulysses, if you can elaborate, tool standpoint or process standpoint, either in the chat feature here real quick.
I will say just, I'll do it as a process standpoint because I think it's a more general concept. Leverage the tools however you see fit. If you have the capability to quarantine stuff, applications, especially development life cycles, is a good place to use that kind of thing. More power to you. I think that's great. I'm a fan of mitigating risk however it needs to be. And if if mitigation means take that PC off the network and don't let it back on until it's fixed, that's a mitigation strategy. Absolutely. You don't need to leave it there while you're waiting for your patch management stuff to kick in. So yeah, I support quarantining efforts. Again, you just need to make sure that it makes sense for your business. One of the challenges I see a lot of organizations get into is they will implement a quarantining policy for their user accounts, for credentials. And sometimes their policies don't take into account the intricacies of the business itself. And so you get situations where if I see this credential logging in from an IP address that's outside the United States, that's clearly an attack, and I block it, flag it, and I don't let it back in. Which is fine until you find out that credential belongs to one of your key database administrators who is on vacation in Japan and got a call at an emergency because the entire business's application is down and that person's the only person who can fix it. And not only are they trying to log in at 3 o'clock in the morning to fix it on vacation, but you just quarantined them, locked them out for the next 24 hours. So quarantining is good, but just make sure that you've got it aligned with your business practices. You're accounting for as many outlier scenarios as you can, because you don't want to have your quarantining thing become something that impacts your business negatively like that.
Of course, thank you very much. Makes sense. Michelle says, we use a blend of frameworks/standards, but there are still agencies and orgs that only will work within NIST or ISO. Isn't a blend future state? ?
I can only tell you my opinion about this particular thing. So I've been on the regulatory side of this context for most all of my career. I started in government. So, I cut my teeth on DOJ requirements, HIPAA, social services, privacy kind of stuff. I was all over the place with these kinds of things. So, yeah, the best practice for a lot of years has been pick one, right? Do NIST 853 or do ISO 27001 and 2, and that becomes your framework and build your program off of that. And most organizations today, they're doing bits and pieces of all of it, right? This vendor does it this way, my auditor wants it done that way, but this regulation says do it the other way. So my opinion, what I see happening is more organizations, rather than trying to either just pick one or trying to do them all, they are building out their own policy requirements, their own sort of frameworks that are an amalgam of all of it, right? They're trying to build a superset, if you will, so that when the NIST auditor comes in, they go, yeah, of our 400 things on our particular framework, these 250 apply to NIST. So we're going to extract those out. We're compliant. You're going to do our ISO audit. Sure. These 300 apply to you. We also have these extra 100 over here that apply just for our business, our purposes, right? I see a lot more of that thing kind of going on. Now, whether NIST or ISO or some of these organizations do it themselves at one point, I'm not sure about that. There's some vested interest to keep them separate by those organizations. But I think what we're seeing is companies are taking it into their own hands. And it's a lot more work, but it makes things much more efficient for the company to run their business, right? Because then it's already done. So when the next framework comes along and they go, well, are you XYZ compliant? yeah, XYZ maps to these things I've already done. So yes, we're good. So yeah, that's what I see happening more and more.
Excellent. 2 questions I'm going to squeeze in here. The first one, does Tenable provide solutions for cloud security via metrics that can be shared with executives?
Yes, we absolutely do. So we have, on top of all of our like vulnerability scanning and assessment kind of tools, we have a tool that we call Lumen. So if you want to check that out, more details on our website, you'll see it there. Lumen is a analysis layer, if you will, on a lot of our vulnerability data. And part of what its job is to do is to take a lot of that technical information and give it a sort of an executive level simplification, if you will. We build all the data up, we funnel it up into this single little number at the top that's kind of like a credit score. Think of it like a credit score that talks about the overall state of the environment. This is what the whole environment looks like. This is what the risk posture looks like. It trends, it does all the graphing and lines for you that way too. So it becomes a much easier thing to help executives understand, right? They don't need to understand 5 or 10 different metrics about vulnerabilities and threats. They need to understand one credit score metric that says the state of the environment is doing good or it's not doing so good. And that's been a really powerful tool we've seen for a lot of CISOs who are trying to build that connection or that communication path. Starting there has been a really simple way to get there. But then Lumen has a lot of other pieces to it as well that you can augment and build up more executive level reporting and more. There's a lot more to it, but it is definitely there if you want to look into that.
Fantastic. So actually two more questions. See if they can stay with us, but there's 2 really good ones.
Sure.
Here. So the first one, how about consuming data from multi-cloud usable Tenable, using Tenable and integrating with our existing SIM solution?
Yes.
Easy. There you go.
Yeah, it's simple. So our products we have massive APIs for just about anything you want to do. We have native connectors to most every SIM on the planet these days. So you have stuff right out of the box. You can build your own. We see a lot of large organizations that have built very robust risk management platforms tied together through a SIM or broader tools, ERM tools, ServiceNow, that kind of stuff. We absolutely integrate with all of that. And I will say just 5 seconds about this. One of the things philosophically we're looking at doing at Tenable, we see the world changing as well for vulnerability management. Like it's become all risk focused and risk based. And the only way we can help our customers better understand vulnerabilities from a risk lens is if we're ingesting more data as well. We've got to understand non-technical concepts, right? We need to know which assets are the most important in your environment. We need to understand, do you have cyber insurance that covers loss for these kinds of things? Can we understand mitigations you have in place that may not be technical? So a lot of work's happening right now to make the connectors we have bi-directional. So you're going to see as time goes on, I think that's going to become more of a normal thing where it's not just Tenable feeding vulnerability data into your SIM, which we do today for nearly everything, but it's going to be to see some of that data coming back so that as we apply threat intelligence, as we apply all of the special sauce, if you will, that makes Tenable what we are, we can actually get better results out of that because we're going to understand your environment that much better.
Excellent, thank you very much. And then the final question is, with the recent cybersecurity executive order from the White House, where plans for all federal agencies to go to zero trust architecture and NIST 800-207 in the upcoming months, will that become the expectations by boards in the coming months?
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, I'm already seeing this extensively with organizations that I speak to. Zero trust is on everyone's minds now. And it's interesting because if you, again, asked me this question a couple of years ago, I think a lot of security practitioners would have rolled their eyes a little bit at the term zero trust. It was seen as very much a buzzword. A lot of organizations, vendors, were using it to mean different things, right? So there's a lot of confusion in the industry about what it meant. And that's why people scoffed, because it was just marketing at that point. But between the executive order, and I've seen a lot of thought leadership coming out of some vendors. In fact, one of our co-founders wrote a great piece. If you go to our website, there's a blog post about this. The security industry is really starting to define what we mean by zero trust. And that definition is really about a mindset. It's an approach to how you do security. It's not a prescriptive framework of 10 steps you must do to achieve zero trust architectures. It's a mindset about how you approach security controls, how you implement it for your organization. So yeah, I think with this new kind of framework and the executive order that came out, which was honestly, I think was fantastic. It's a step in the right direction. But more executives are absolutely talking about zero trust. And more importantly, they're talking about it in the right way. They're coming back to their security practitioners and saying, what does zero trust mean for us? And how are we going to do our own version of zero trust? And that is the correct question. You don't want an executive coming back to you and saying, well, vendor A just told me if we give them $5 million, we will be zero trust compliant. That will not go well for your organization. So it's a mindset, take it as an approach, and yeah, expect that your executives are going to be asking you about it, and guide them that path, because it's going to be gone on the table for the foreseeable future, for sure.
Excellent stuff. Great way to end the session, and a great way to end the conference as a whole. So at this point, as always, I'd like to ask the audience to join me in a virtual round of applause for our speakers. Thank you very much, Nathan. Extremely much, greatly appreciated. Fantastic insights, fantastic catalysts. We love to see. So.